Hey, and welcome to the next episode of Microsoft Dev Radio. I'm your host, Jerry, and I'm here with Darren May right in Colorado.
Wonderful Colorado. It's actually not snowing for a change.
No, it's nice. We've had almost 2 days of sun.
Indeed. Solid.
It was a really nice weekend, actually. It was pretty nice. Let me ask you something. In your career, you're kind of a Microsoft Stack developer. Mm-hmm. You have used many databases. Have you ever used SQL Server?
SQL Server.
Yeah. Is
only about 98% of the time.
I don't care. SQL Server, I mean, how many times have you shipped out SQL Server Express out to a client somewhere, so you can do some sort of weird replication?
Well, when that was the only option, for a lightweight database, SQL Express, but obviously we also had the basic built-in version that you could ship alongside. That didn't actually have an install footprint.
What's that called? LocalDB.
LocalDB, yeah. That was pretty revolutionary when that came along.
These little things, it's funny because all these other developers who are like, SQL Server, what's that? Oh my gosh, I pity them. I'm like, I'm so sad for you and your terrible life. It's just awful.
Well, I mean, we've been there along the journey, when it started off as the departmental database of choice, SQL 97 and so on. And then look how it's grown.
Oh my gosh. It's the fastest database in the world, Darren. Think about that. It's the fastest database in the world. It's crazy. Anyway, and then now it's Azure and scalable and blah, blah, blah. It's incredible.
And just look at how that developed. You started off with quite a limited size database on Azure, and now it's huge.
Now, there's a lot of tooling to be able to use Visual Studio. Most of us have installed. Remember Visual Studio? What was it? It was the Business Intelligent Development System Service.
You lost me at intelligent.
Anyway, I remember that forever. That was Visual Studio 2008. That was like just the beginning. You could make a cube and all these other things. And as hard as it was, I started as a VB.NET developer. That's because I started in VB, went to VB. I started VB Script, by the way, as an awesome ASP.NET or not
I can always tell.
ASP developer. Yeah, thanks. And then the migration of my brain to go from VB to C# was actually relatively difficult, but not terrible. But nothing is as hard as understanding result sets in SQL. Like that transition, you're like, oh, I'm just going to loop through a cursor, or all the dumb things you do because you don't understand it. And then all of a sudden, you start dreaming in SQL. And all of a sudden, you have these gigantic result sets that are pivoting in the air.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it just happened last week. Anyway, let's go back. So there it is. SQL, to access it is T-SQL, this wonderful language. And to be able to really make it play correctly, you have all these tooling. Wouldn't it be great if we could get the PM of the tools team for SQL on this show?
It would be awesome to understand where it's going. Do we still need the Visual Studio shell to use all of these toolings?
All of those questions are going to be answered and more because we have Vicki on the show on this episode of Dev Radio. Hey, and welcome back. This is Microsoft Dev Radio. I'm Jerry. This is Darren, and we have Vicki Harp. Vicki, thank you for being on the show today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Now, Vicki, you are the PM lead for the SQL Tools Team. This is an amazing opportunity to talk to you. I can't even tell you, but you're famous on Twitter and everywhere else. Tell us a little bit about who you are for anybody in our audience who may not know.
Sure. My name is Vicki, as you said. I'm the PM manager for the SQL Server Tools Team. So the SQL Server Tools Team is in the SQL engineering group, and we cover the set of tools for basically all the tools and experiences for SQL Server from the driver level up to the portal level. That includes the CLI tools, that includes PowerShell, that includes assemblies like DAC effects and SMO, that includes SSMS, Visual Studio, SQL Server projects, MS SQL extension for VS Code, Azure Data Studio, and basically all of the tools that you can think of that you use with SQL Server basically accrue to this team.
I forgot about Visual Studio, or about the projects in Visual Studio, how great those are. Oh my gosh, yeah.
Source control.
Yeah, man, that was the beginning of the beginning in my mind. Vicki, let's back up. You just listed off about 1 billion things, and I know there's some others that you didn't take the time to list.
So it must be just a team of 2 that's doing all that.
Yeah,
just
exactly.
a handful?
A couple of us, yeah.
You know what? I mean, if you think about how big Azure is, and you think about how big Windows is, and you think about how big Office is, it's important to look at those and remember that SQL Server is the most profitable product Microsoft has. Like, it is unbelievable. And hey, earlier we were talking about how fast SQL Server is. Is it still fast?
Oh, yeah, it's incredibly fast. It's incredibly fast, and it's hitting benchmarks across a wider set of configurations now because with recent versions of SQL Server, we can now run on Linux. So that brings in container stories, that brings in Kubernetes, that brings in Linux. And then we, of course, have cloud, and then we have on-box, both virtualized and bare metal. So that's a huge variety of things that we can be testing against and benchmarking against. And of course, with that, for my job, that's a huge number of deployment options that people have where they're interacting with the server. And so that really makes my job interesting and complicated.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure testing must be a nightmare.
Yeah. A wonderful nightmare.
It's something that we're very proud of, that they really focus on the fundamentals here. It's such an important product. It's used in so many important applications that the testing is taken very seriously here. We have, continuous integration. We've got a lot of testing that goes on constantly. Actually, they use Kubernetes to do a lot of the testing of SQL Server Engine now, which gives us a lot of flexibility to spin up and run tests. And then I can actually, as we're going, I can tell you a little bit about how we're beginning to change the way that we're testing the tools. It's kind of some interesting stuff coming up.
Okay, that's cool.
I want to know. Okay,
yeah.
Let's talk about the suite of tools. I'm a developer. I'm a SQL developer. Now, let's talk about SQL in Azure and assume that we're always talking about SQL in Azure unless there's a big difference between on-prem, because otherwise they're the same almost all the time. So let's just
is that true? Are they the same almost all the time?
So the surface area is extremely similar. Back in SQL Server 2016, there was a change made so that the programming surface area was made fundamentally identical amongst the different versions of SQL, or rather the different editions of SQL. Versions are a different thing, so that you didn't have so much the problem of I can't develop this because it only works on Enterprise Edition, and then as an ISV, I have to ask people to choose a particular version of an edition of SQL Server. So that on that front, especially on what we call box or the VM and on-premises versions, it's pretty much the same. In the cloud, we have kind of almost, you can think of a slider of how much manageability you want to have, from I want a VM and I want to manage it entirely, to I want a managed instance, Azure SQL managed instance, up to SQL DB where I just want a database and I don't want to worry about the server. Those have different surface areas, just because if you're dealing with something at a database level, then you don't have the same surface area as the server level. But for the most part, that should ring pretty true to people on their workloads. I don't think people would be confused that they're, using Azure SQL database and they're not getting options related to setting affinity settings for the processor, etc.
So almost the same is what
almost
you're
the
saying.
Same from the application developer's perspective. It's mostly T-SQL. Honestly, most of the time when I'm thinking about it, I kind of over-index into all of the manageability settings for configuration and for setup. But when you're talking about your application development, you're talking about T-SQL, it's primarily the same.
So as a developer, I'm writing the same T-SQL no matter which location I'm going to, right?
Exactly.
It feels the same. I can use the same entity framework and all those things as well. All right, my desktop, I'm going to have Visual Studio installed because I'm writing a nice .NET line of business application in UWP, maybe, or maybe WPF. And what other tools am I going to need to install? Because now I'm going to be the database developer as well. Smaller companies don't always separate those workloads.
Right. So there's, I'll start with Visual Studio where you're most familiar, and then I'll kind of work my way out. So in Visual Studio, whenever you install it, you can also install the SQL projects support, which gives you the ability to build projects in SQL Server for SQL Server and do source control, do diffing, do schema compare, and then you can actually do deployments and builds.
And semantic renaming. Don't forget that.
Yes.
Really nice.
So it has a huge number of features, and it's very specifically made for the application developer in the Visual Studio world. If you're using VS Code and you kind of are not using the big sister Visual Studio, but using VS Code, we also have an MS SQL extension for VS Code that gives some of the browsing and SQL editing capabilities for VS Code, but VS Code is less of a GUI focused tool, so it's a little bit different from what you'd expect in Visual Studio. From there, you'd probably be wanting to look at having some of the command line tools. So we have a MS I'm now going to forget the name of it, but we have a PowerShell provider for PowerShell so that you can use PowerShell. We have a number of command line tools. SQL CMD and BCP are probably the most popular. SQL CMD being a command line interactive query, runner, and then BCP being a bulk copy provider. We have a
SQL command was command line before command line was cool.
Yeah,
exactly.
That was, back in the early days for sure. And so now we have a more recent command line tool called MS SQL CLI, which is part of the DB CLI open source project. And it's really more for interactive purposes, but it's command line, but it has things like IntelliSense and code completion. So it's a little bit richer experience if you're doing interactive. And then from there, if you were really doing a lot of SQL coding, then you might want to move into some of the SQL specific tool sets. So on Windows, SSMS is the one that's been around since basically since SQL 2005, I think.
Let's see, SSMS is SQL Server Management Studio, and it doesn't install with Visual Studio. You have to go get it.
Yes, you have to go install it. And then,
does that still use an earlier version of the Visual Studio shell, or is that keeping pace with the releases of Visual Studio?
So with SSMS 18, it's using the VS 2017 shell. Of course, as soon as that released, Visual Studio 2019 came out. That's just the way that goes. But it is keeping relative pace, which is actually an interesting segue over to Azure Data Studio, which is the other client tool for SQL Server. It's cross-platform, and it's based on the VS Code shell. And that one is actually a daily integrated fork of VS Code. So in terms of it staying on top of the VS Code updates, it's on a daily basis. And you can get that as a separate download, and it's also available on GitHub.
Wait, let me just tease out what we just said. So some developers may have SSMS installed, and they maybe have had it installed for the last 2 decades.
Yes.
And then maybe some developers now might forego installing SSMS, and they might install Data Studio instead. And
right. So Azure Data Studio is, for one thing, it's cross-platform. So if you're doing your development on a Mac or on Linux, or if you have any need to be doing some SQL work on those platforms, it's your best bet. It's going to be your full query editor, your object browsers, a lot of graphing capabilities, and things like that that you can use cross-platform. If you have SSMS installed, Azure Data Studio is kind of an also, because SSMS has 15 years and
it's
hundreds of man years of development effort into it. But Azure Data Studio has a little bit of a different lightweight extension-based approach, so you can kind of set up the extensions for the actual work you're doing. In SSMS is more of a 747 cockpit, where every time you right-click on something, there's 80 options. We're aware of that. Whereas in Azure Data Studio, you can go into the extension manager and turn on, if you're using import or using agent, et cetera, turn those things on and off as far as having them visualize.
So the experience for a developer might be they install Data Studio, and there are some features of SQL Server they may not be able to manipulate in Data. There may be an extension that maybe helps them get a few more. There may be another extension, but eventually they may find a wall where they can't do something. SSMS, there is no wall. You can do all things SQL.
Correct, and that's going to be the case, for the future, because Azure Data Studio, in addition to SQL Server, is also Postgres, and our intention is to take it wider for more of the Azure data services. And so it's going to probably use more of an extension-based approach to bring in the different high-demand features. Whereas if you're doing really deep Windows-based application developer work on for SQL Server, and you need some of those, I guess, less run wizards and things, then they're probably going to be in SSMS.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Now, the other big thing that Azure Data Studio has is Jupyter Notebooks. And so that's been one of the major differentiators for a workflow perspective as far as why somebody might choose Azure Data Studio over SSMS.
So I've used Jupyter Notebooks for Python, and is a great way in Python to explore data manipulation, bring back result sets, and do kind of incremental processing of data. Is it a similar experience in SQL?
Yeah.
Talk me through that a little bit.
So what we have in Azure Data Studio is the Jupyter Notebook server. It ships inside the box. And then we have our own viewer for it. And with that, we have a SQL kernel. So the SQL kernel in Jupyter, kernels are kind of the combination of the language and the execution space. And so with the SQL kernel, you can attach to a SQL Server or, in fact, a PostgreSQL endpoint, and you can run your SQL commands. And it's similar to if you're running traditional T-SQL and you have a Go separator, kind of a batch separator, that's what each of the cells is. And so we have that in there, and it's comes in by default. It doesn't require Python to allow people to switch from more of a disconnected result set to a connected result set. So this is the thing. When you think about running SQL in SSMS, you would run it, and then if you had the result sets, you'd copy them into Excel or you put them into an RPT file, but they were fundamentally disconnected. And that doesn't really work with people's contemporary workflows whenever they're doing analysis, when they're sharing information. They want to have that combination of prose and human readable markdown, the code, and then the results, and then they can share it, troubleshooting runbooks, deployment runbooks, things like that. Now, also, you can still run Python. So if you switch over, we also have Python, R, Spark, a bunch of other kernels available. So for people who are familiar with and comfortable with Python, you can certainly switch over to Python. Then you'd be using, the PyODBC connector to connect to SQL Server in that way and bring data into data frames. So all of that really works out very nicely as far as being able to work with data in multiple data sources, being able to work on cloud, on-prem, polycloud sort of situations, and then making that ultimately shareable. And we're using the same IPYMB file format as the other Jupyter notebooks. We basically are all playing nicely. So if you were to work on a notebook in Azure Data Studio and then want to go work on it in a different viewer, they would work just fine. So one of the nice things that we're seeing now in the community is people are making blog posts with a bunch of, example SQL, and then they're putting that in a notebook you can download and follow along on your own machine. It has the results that were in the blog post embedded, but then you can run it against your own instance and see how it turns out.
Is that experience sort of primarily targeted at developers, or would administrators also have some benefits for tuning and those kind of things?
We see both. So for administrators, it's a lot of troubleshooting type run books, troubleshooting guides, standard operating procedures, things like that. And developers, it might be more of the innovative portion of doing your work. So I like to tell people, thinking about how you would do machine learning. Let's say you're trying to write something that's going to detect prescription fraud. Now, where you actually start with that is, I have a data and I have a problem to solve, and you need to iteratively work through and use your own knowledge of the different type of machine learning capabilities to get to there. And so you start at the beginning with the data, and you can do some data cleaning, and then you work through, and maybe you experiment, maybe you send some things up to do some cloud-based compute because you don't want to do it on your local machine. You're pulling data locally, you're pulling data remote. And then once you get through it, you've sort of got this report of, here are the steps that I went through. And then here at the end is the operationalizable code. Yeah. So that sort of work stream is a little bit more focused on the developer. And we think it's kind of an emerging new kind of developer, because this is the type of developer who they may need to step aside and work on a bunch of intermediate code to define a ML flow. And then that machine learning is what they're going to operationalize. That intermediate code, that exploratory code, isn't being productionalized itself, but you need to keep it around as an artifact to understand it and maybe tune it in the future.
Yes, that's what I found with Python and the Jupyter notebooks, is it's very incremental learning. You start off with a hypothesis, you can go through a couple of different scenarios, you can evolve it, you can go back in time and edit a previous step and then take those results forward and see how that impact goes. Then you can version it and so on and so forth. So I was very excited. I had no idea that was coming to SQL Server. So I think that's an awesome addition.
Yeah,
it's
definitely.
Also very nice for source control purposes, to be able to source control that all of those notes, all of those comments, all of those results together. So even for, pretty pedestrian use cases, like I want to run all of these troubleshooting things and see what the results were, and then source control it, and then come back a month later when something's not going well and run it again, see if it was the same as it was a month ago. This is the sort of thing that people were writing monitoring tools to do before, and it really doesn't have to be that complicated.
Yeah, and it's certainly a lot easier than writing a bunch of command line scripts and then working out how you're going to persist all of that information.
And
I can also picture it for demos, how nice it'll be.
I love it for demos. A
giant script file and everything's commented out.
Yeah.
What's really beautiful for demos is you've been here, I've been here. You're trying to do demos with the cloud, and then it turns out that the Wi-Fi conference, et cetera, isn't going to hold up, and you're really just you and your laptop, right? So if you have a notebook you've pre-run, you've got all the results there. So you just swap over to that one and say, I'm sorry, we don't have conference Wi-Fi, but here's what I ran earlier today. It's kind of the cooking show version of a demo.
Yeah.
Really nicely.
Yeah, that's a nice option, though.
Yeah.
It was live
like some
last
of our
night
demos.
in my hotel.
Yeah, where we pretend to type as we're playing back a video.
It's like telling a story to Daren and he pretends to listen. It's exactly like that.
Did you say something?
What's that? So all right, so we have Jupyter Notebooks. We have the new Data Studio. We have SSMS, of course, that most SQL developers already know. There's a little bit of tooling inside Visual Studio itself that you can use directly, as well as
just the odd project. 1 or 2 features.
Well, I just mean you could write queries, is what I mean. You can do that. Redgate, of course, has a whole bunch of stuff that snaps in nicely. And then there's this other thing called the Azure Data Explorer. Is that in your team as well?
That is not in my team, but it comes up a lot, so I'll explain what it is. Azure Data Explorer is actually a data service, whereas what I have are data tools. So Azure Data Explorer is something that you would subscribe and use as a data service on Azure, whereas the tools that I'm talking about are things you would download and install on your machine.
I see, yes. And so the way I understand Data Explorer is if you're running a query and you needed all the data, you would have to pull all that data down to your local machine to run it. But you can use Data Explorer to run it all in the cloud instead. And you don't need a VM or anything. It's just a service that sits there for you. It's pretty cool.
So what has .NET Core done to you and your team in terms of tooling and supporting and so on and so forth? I mean, because obviously when SQL Server was exclusively Windows, you could bake a lot of the SQL client, for example, into the installed framework that was on your Windows machine. Now we've got multiple platform. Now we've got .NET Core. We're moving to .NET 5 in 2020 and so on. What sort of impact has that had on your team?
That's a really insightful question, and actually it has had impact. It's basically 2 major impacts. One is we need to use .NET Core more often. So even in our tooling team, as we're writing cross-platform things, we're having to exercise the .NET Core framework. And then 2, as you called out, the shipping vehicle isn't really appropriate anymore to be putting the .NET SQL client in Core and also in framework was getting a bit strange. You have some different service area, things are kind of iterating differently. So actually, just at Build, we announced that we are now moving to a new SQL client, which is Microsoft.data.SQL client, whereas before it was System.data.SQL client. And this is going to be the new framework, or the new process by which we ship new driver features for SQL Server. The existing one is not going to change and go away for the features in market SQL Server up to this date. They're going to work the same as they have, and the same on the .NET Core side. But the new framework will have both .NET Core and framework inside the box, and it's a NuGet package that we can version more quickly and independently. That's another thing that's come up recently. SQL Server is shipping a lot more often, both for the cloud editions that are shipping kind of continuously, and then even the box versions are shipping quite often now. And so we have the need to ship and control those ship dates more tightly than whenever you're kind of in part of someone else's framework and you're having to kind of work all those things out. So by putting in a NuGet package, we're able to get things out a little bit more iteratively. So that's out available now to preview. It is in the current version mostly a port over of the existing functionality with a few additional features that have been added, particularly in bringing the .NET Core up to the .NET framework standards in terms of always encrypted and some of those features that the community has been wanting. Those are going into the new Microsoft.data.SQL client package.
Have you noticed, or you or your team noticed, any sort of performance improvements? A lot of talk about .NET Core 3 has been that there's been some I/O performance improvements and so on and so forth. Have you been able to see that and realize any of that, or has that been more under the radar?
It's been a little bit more under the radar because we were always trying to improve the driver itself. So the SQL client driver is, basically working on the TDS protocol. And when we're trying to make improvements to it, a lot of times we're very focused on those improvements and less so to the application framework as such. And so there may have been some improvements, but we're tracking a little bit more closely on the improvements inside the driver.
Okay, cool. Now, you had a pretty interesting thread on Twitter not so long ago about T-SQL, declarative T-SQL. Walk me through what happened.
Okay, yeah. So this was actually a funny one. And I think that I responded initially to a joke made by Swift on Security about the the fact that people kind of make fun of SQL Server as being kind of old and busted or whatever, and then they find out that actually Stack Overflow runs on SQL Server.
Right. And most of the other Fortune 500 companies do.
Exactly. And basically, the odds are you interacted with a SQL Server sometime today. You may not know it, but sometime turning on your lights or turning on your water or driving in your car, at some point you probably interacted with a SQL Server transaction. So it is incredibly widespread, but people kind of forget about it, which is the sign of a good tool, right? So if you can kind of forget about it. And so I made a comment about how people forget about SQL as a declarative language and all the power that goes into it. And so there was a little bit of, what does that mean exactly? And so the gist of it is that I think that people forget the difference between declarative and imperative languages and procedural languages. So most of the code that we do is procedural languages, object-oriented programming, where we're giving instructions to the computer. With a declarative language like SQL, you're actually giving the desired output to the computer, and then a query optimizer will write the program for you on the fly. And this is an inversion, and I think that it's really important for application developers to understand this, because it makes it clear how important it is to be precise in what you're requesting. The difference between asking how many rows are in this and asking, is there a row in this, is extremely different. Because if you're saying how many rows are in this, then the program that SQL Server is going to write is going to say, all right, let's go and read every single row in that table and count them and give it back to you in a transactionally accurate, repeatable form. If you're saying, I just want to know if this table is empty, then it's going to say, oh, no, yeah, it's not empty. I can tell, the metadata is there. And so the performance differences you get can change a lot just by asking for what you really meant to ask for. But what I see instead is, from a very understandable point of view, people look at this and they think, it's not understanding what I want. I'm just going to do it myself with my procedural language. So then you these patterns people will do things like in their application code, write loops to go back to SQL Server and ask for one more thing and one more thing and one more thing.
It immediately ruins SQL Server by doing it.
Cursors. It does, because exactly, cursors. And it's a very understandable mindset for people, but I think what people don't understand is under the hood there, whenever you get the query and it's being optimized, SQL Server is aware of the index structure. It's aware of statistics about the cardinality and the frequency of the certain things. People have created their PhDs over all the different loop and join structures that are present in there, knowing whether it should be hash, whether it should be a slower join format that can actually be parallelized across a number of schedulers, whether those schedulers are available to be parallelized across. It even gets into like NUMA node scheduling and the memory proximity to different NUMA nodes, all of that type stuff that if you were trying to write it yourself procedurally, you'd spend a month on it, honestly. And so whenever you bypass
I got it. It's just so nice. Like people just like it is just so nice. It's not the query optimizer SQL Server is not an open source project that we're contributing to. I mean, it is the crown jewel of SQL Server that has been research and money and people have been poured on it for just decade after decade. It is so tuned. It is crazy. Like, it is crazy.
It's one of the unfortunate things I actually think with where programming and development move to in terms of, code first and just emitting very simplistic models and just having very lightweight, simplistic attributing to try and hint to SQL Server to try and optimize performance. That to a certain extent, back when we started, just after we stopped chipping stone, you had people that understood the mathematics of database optimization, understood, as you mentioned, B-tree versus hash, all of these different types of storage algorithms that took the time to understand, okay, one, how are we going to be loading data? Are we bulk loading data? Do we want to bulk load, then index? Do we want to index as we go? Then how are we accessing it? Are we accessing a particular subset of records very frequently? Do we need to work out how we partition that data to optimize that? Or do we just throw it all on one big fast disk because it's going to be totally random across everything?
Yeah. Not today.
So much of that has been lost, hasn't it? And I think, that's where a lot of people went, okay, document DBs are the answer.
Right. Unstructured everything.
Is because they were getting damn lazy.
Well, that's your conclusion. I'm not going to say that.
But that's what so it's really interesting and intriguing to me to see that there's still so much time and energy being spent in wringing every cycle of performance out of something like SQL Server that is, as you mentioned, so key to so many large organizations. But again, it's another of those things that's a lot under the radar for a lot of people. They just don't realize the power that's there.
It used to be really common for you on your resume to put SQL tuning as something that you really understood. Maybe you went to class or had the experience or whatever.
Yep.
Man, you wouldn't see that today because people don't understand the intricacies of it because of whatever, right? And as a result, they have all these weird complications. We have to make this faster, so we'll buy like 8 more VMs to make it faster. And like, well, there's a better way.
Yeah, or you could stop using your ORM that's slowing everything down.
Well, that's a totally different conversation. I know. So many things get blamed, and it's not SQL's fault. Vicki, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but I just love the query optimizer, and it just doesn't get the love it deserves in public.
No, I totally agree, and that's kind of what the point of my thread was. What's funny is that people who love programming, I think that you can start to get focused on your job and forget the love of it. And this is something that I find is just beautiful. Like if you think about as a musician, you love music. As a programmer, you can look at something like the query optimizer and you can appreciate it and love it for what it is, even if you don't have to get into the intricacies of it. And, I encourage people to do that and to not feel this sort of, it's me versus the database. I mean, we've got speed of light problems. We've got spinning disks problems. We've got all sorts of infrastructure things that we all have to deal with all the time at every level. The fighting over the fact, relational versus non-relational, it's a little bit silly, because there's a lot of beauty in data access and all of the work that goes into it. I find it really exciting to work with, and I guess that's why I'm where I am.
Vicki, what's the largest SQL table in terms of rows you've ever seen?
Oh, geez. Me personally, that's that funny thing. We're working on the tools team. I don't myself see them as much, but I hear tale of them.
Okay.
And so I hear about just billions and billions of rows. And what you hear sometimes is you see that people have applications where they're just scanning that whole huge table. I mean, even into the billions of rows, let's say they're just scanning them and scanning them. You get into problems where people have run out of integers on their identity key.
Let's go in.
Yes. And so that's happened. And so people have to move to big int, or they have to reseed at a negative identity in order to catch up.
Fascinating. Then your key is negative.
Well, then just imagine, you've got to cascade all the way through your database those changes to relink everything that goes to that identity.
I've seen a table with 1 billion, and the query was still sub-second. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, and so what's funny is that no matter how big it gets, if you've got the right indexing in place, it's not that hard. I tell people it's kind of like a phone book, right? Doesn't really matter how big the yellow pages is if you really know that you're going to this one section of the yellow pages, right? Like once you can find the right letter, you just dive right into it.
Yellow page. That your examples could have slowly fade away.
I know. I was thinking about the other day. I was trying to come up with.
Maybe you could use an encyclopedia instead.
Another like physical example. Because the nice thing about the yellow pages is that you then talk about the white pages, and it's 2 different indexes. The white pages is the clustered index, and the yellow pages is a non-clustered index.
Yeah, I know my kids are going, what is a yellow page?
What is yellow page? It's this thing that gets put on your porch once a year for no reason. So.
Oh, and they will step over it for weeks before they bring it in.
Yeah. You stack them up to bring your laptop up higher, right? So that's what they're for.
And it's really, I think it's a misunderstanding with developers today to feel like technology is caught up and will auto-tune sufficiently beyond what they could do, because nobody knows your application and your data as well as you do. And you can have the auto-tuner, you can have the wizard, you can have all of these things really, really help you identify based on patterns and behavior. But there's still these things that only you know because you are the developer of that application.
Every time you talk about auto-tune, I'm thinking about Drake or Kanye.
Yeah. Sorry, index auto-tuning.
So I think about that when a good example would be which columns are you requesting? So SQL Server is going to treat it that every one of those columns is equally important, right? You as the developer know that not actually still using that fifth column, right? Like we stopped, we re-architected, we stopped using it. Well, SQL Server will burn itself to the ground trying to get that fifth column for you. And if you don't want it, you could maybe save yourself some effort. And sometimes just removing the number of columns that you're returning, it's like, oh, but it doesn't look like much, right? It's like, but maybe these 3 columns are in an index and these other 2 aren't, and it's having to do like repeated page lookups into a heap. And then you remove that 1 column, it's so much faster.
That's the whole ORM challenge, because the ORM challenge is bringing back all the fields that you've mapped on your objects and so on and so forth when you're displaying 3 things on your screen.
Yeah, that's right. Except for Dapper. Dapper's not that way.
Yeah. A lot of it's more dynamic, that's for sure.
The how are developers responding to the tooling?
So the feedback has been pretty positive on Azure Data Studio. The number of users is growing up slowly compared to SSMS. It's not going to be quite as large as that, but we only went to GA at Ignite. So we're kind of getting out and trying to tell people about it. One of the things that's landed pretty well is that it is open source, and we're in the process of trying to take more of our applications open source at the tooling level. And so engineers and developers respond really well to that, where they can get in and they can make their own extensions, make their own improvements. They can contribute back either to the base product or with extensions. So we've got extensions from commercial third-party vendors, but we've also got them from individuals, just like you see in VS Code. Yeah. And that's helping us build a bridge and kind of a community with our users. And because we're able to ship monthly in this faster cadence, it's really just kind of a new day for SQL tooling. And back in SQL, I guess 2016, the tools were moved out of box from SQL Server. And this was a big motion that probably didn't seem as big at the time, but it used to be that the SQL Server tools were basically on the ISO for SQL Server. So it had to go through the same release cycle as all of SQL Server. And now that it's out of box and we're able to ship
and
them
if you wanted to
own,
install them, you have to download all of SQL Server.
All of SQL Server, exactly. So now it's out of box, and it means that we're able to ship on our own schedules, and we're able to ship each of the many different tools as they need. So either for service packs, updates, or feature improvements. So that's all landing pretty well. We're also pretty active on Twitter and on Slack and on Gitter and things like that to try to build those bridges. So I feel like it's going pretty well.
Yeah. And is the CLI popularity going up as well? Do you notice?
Yeah. So with the popularity of VS Code, a lot of people do want to do things kind of in the CLI, bring up the terminal. So we PowerShell and then the CLI tools both are very popular. Certainly if you were to mess something up, you'd hear about it with a quickness. So we try to keep those pretty much in line. Which reminds me, I was going to tell you a little bit about how we were using, how we were changing some of our testing. So I mentioned earlier having the Jupyter Notebooks. So Jupyter Notebooks can be run from the command line. So we're beginning to do testing within Jupyter Notebooks to see what an experience is end to end. You can take hero scenarios, you can take troubleshooting scenarios, and then you can put them as GCI tests into the SQL engine, so that whenever someone checks in a change to SQL engine, it can run all of the Jupyter Notebooks related to, say, the experience, and it would tell them at their moment of check-in if they were about to break the tooling without having to run all of the tool tests themselves.
Cool, so the notebook is a unit test.
Yeah,
kind of.
Almost an integration test, in fact, because it can span multiple things.
Oh, that's right. It's not
so it has all of the different command lines that we need to run. And then that notebook itself could be the thing that we're using to distribute an experience. So in SQL Server 2019 Big Data Clusters, for example, we have a notebook that will create an AKS cluster, which is a Kubernetes cluster, and then it'll deploy the SQL Server Big Data Cluster to it with the head node of the controller and then all of its supporting services. This is a complex installation, and you can go through a wizard, but the wizard is not something that you can operationalize or script. So we put in a notebook instead, and then that notebook is something that we can run every day on a test, and then we actually give that notebook to the users as their experience. So you get the notebook, here's how you install it, run all the cells.
Oh, and then I get the notebook.
Yeah, you get the notebook. And then if you want to change one of the settings in there, you don't have to take our word for it, go back to reading Rainbow. You can just read through it and say, I want to change this environment variable or this setting in Kubernetes here before I hit run.
I think what's so cool about that is, it opens the black box, doesn't it? Because as you say, the whole sort of setup scenario is completely closed unless you go in and mess around it, inf files and so on and so forth. Now it's a completely sort of I guess you still need to be
really nice,
somewhat of an expert, but it's much easier to parse and understand what's going on.
And really, a lot of times people do go through these wizards and then they hit generate script at the end. So they wanted the script. They were using the wizard to fill in the variables, and we'll still make those things available, but people are more comfortable with command line. People are more comfortable with code now, so we should just give it to them. At least, especially when we're in the early stages and iterating on things, let's give you a notebook and let you play with it. And then we can use it as our own testing as well. So if somebody were to check in something that's going to break that, they can then check in a change to that notebook, and then that would be what the user would get, was the updated notebook. So it really smoothed things over. We're doing some experimentation in that front, but we're finding it works really well.
Cool. So you mentioned the command line tools, and obviously you're targeting multiple platforms now. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that have been holding back Windows to a certain extent was the command shell wasn't perhaps as advanced as some of the other shells on other platforms. In an upcoming episode, we're actually going to be talking about the new Windows terminal that's coming along. Have you guys done any work with the terminals team to exploit any of the new features?
No, we haven't worked with them directly, but I would think that our use cases are pretty generic and they should work pretty well. The improvements we've been making, like I said, we work on MS SQL CLI, which is the DB CLI project. That's Python based, and then it allows you to get some more of the interactivity. But a lot of the SQL Server command line tools go back to early days of SQL Server. These are written in native code, and these are extremely bulletproof, battle-hardened applications. And so throwing them into a more performance shell is going to be nice for them. But I'm not anticipating a lot of need to change the surface area. But it is true, we are now doing cross-platform. And so that's another reason that we're kind of looking into the Python approach so that we can have more cross-platform CLI tools, and you can take the same CLI command from platform to platform, particularly with SQL in Linux and containers where you may have only a CLI surface area. It's important for you to have that and to not feel like you have to reinvent the wheel just to get the same thing done that you were doing on premises.
You can't tell a developer to run SQL Server in Linux and then to run all their development environment in Windows so they can use
exactly that. For some reason that doesn't land, Yeah.
Do you see SQL Server? Actually, let me back up just for a second with the tooling. So we have Data Studio and we have SSMS. How far in the future do we need to go before the tooling converges somehow? I mean, there must be some sort of dreamland out there where like, we know two tools isn't like perfect. You know what I mean?
So our plan right now that we're executing on is to have the tools intercommunicate better. So in SSMS, you can launch things from Azure Data Studio, and in Azure Data Studio, you can launch things from SSMS. So if you think about SSMS, if you use it a lot, it is the land of modeless dialog windows. It really is. Mm-hmm. So you right-click on something and up comes a modeless dialog window. There's nothing about that dialog window that has to be based in that Visual Studio shell. It is a dialog window. So you can right-click in Azure Data Studio and bring up that same dialog window, go through the same motions. So it is essentially bringing that feature over you're calling into the 32-bit Windows code from the 64-bit cross-platform code, and vice versa. So from the SSMS, if you want to pull up a wizard and that wizard happened to have been written in Azure Data Studio, there's no reason it can't launch it. It's already modeless. A lot of the application, a lot of the things that you launch from SSMS are actually already separate executable. So SQL Agent and the replication monitor, those are actually separate exes that it's launching, and they just kind of have the same look and feel. So we're working on that now to get them kind of closer together. And then you can think of it more like if you want to be working in a cross-platform, RDBMS format where you're mixing Postgres and SQL Server, and you have a lot of Azure workloads and things like that. You might be working in Azure Data Studio first, and then maybe you have a really deep, I really got to get into this naughty thing for SQL Server. Let's dive into the 747. You go to the SSMS. Whereas if you're normally working in SSMS, that's fine. We're not going to abandon anybody, doing a lot of performance tuning, a lot of things like that. And then you're like, well, what I really want to do is make a workbook or a run book. I'm going to start a new notebook. It's going to open that up in Azure Data Studio for you. But you as a user shouldn't have to be sitting here taking a mental inventory of where does each feature live exactly. We can help navigate that for you.
Okay. Yeah, that's nice. So pretty soon they'll be in near parity.
Yes, but basically through integration. It's not really a great use of time for us to go and re-implement a lot of features that work perfectly well in SSMS unless there's a strong need.
Especially as you're talking about, you're focusing on hitting the top scenarios first, which obviously is going to be your wider audience to a more narrow audience, and it doesn't necessarily make sense, as you say, to spend a lot of resources addressing 1%.
Right, and some of the things that are available in SSMS, they're GUI workflows for things that people often do via PowerShell now. SQL Server has been around for 30 years, and there's been a lot of changes to the ways that people expect to interact with their services now. I think with cloud, people are a little bit more comfortable in general working from the command line, just understanding that they're not connected to, this is not a console that's located on the same physical machine as my server. And so they're more comfortable going to scripting first. And so some of the things that had to have a full fidelity GUI experience in 2008, we might not make that decision again now. And so re-implementing it for the sake that it had been implemented once before might not be the right choice.
Well, certainly the cloud is pushing configuration as code, isn't it? That you really want to be able to have this repeatable scenario in case you need to ramp up additional resources in the same way, and so on and so forth. Whereas when you had that one single SQL server that was on premises, you weren't addressing the same sort of scenario. So I could see how that's evolving.
Yeah, SQL Server is one of the biggest examples of the pets versus cattle approach, with containers and with resources generally, where it was the ultimate pet, right? You couldn't let anything go wrong with it. You had to keep it all very happy.
Keep grooming it.
And keep grooming it. And even on that, we're trying to help people change their minds and understand that even with that, it's their data that is that. It's not SQL Server that is that. SQL Server is an application engine, right? So you can put that in a container, and you can have a bunch of those containers, and they share storage. And that persistent storage, that's very important. But these individual containers, just shoot them, just start them. You want to upgrade, bring up a new one that has the right version, and take off the old one. And people are so used to treating SQL Server as this like special jewel that you can't breathe on, that getting them comfortable with the idea of using it in Kubernetes or in containers or even in cloud can cause some discomfort just from their past experience.
Yeah. Gone are the days of just spooling up a bigger machine.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you can still do it.
Yeah.
You can still go up. Really, really expensive. It's measured in expensiveness.
Yes. Per core. Right. So that's interesting, actually, in terms of the licensing, because licensing was always around per core and so on. How does that map over to the Kubernetes world?
Well, the licensing is actually something that I don't get very involved with. I'd say that in general, it's an evolving area. Cloud licensing and on-prem licensing are continue to be, relatively complex enterprise topics. So I'd say that, we're listening to the market and trying to make it work for them.
Okay, cool.
There is this vCore thing. There's a lot of little things there.
There's a lot of nuances to it.
Yeah, that's right.
So, each time we open up a different channel, it's, another question to think about.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm a software developer. I've decided to go ahead and install the Data Studio because I'm curious. And I think probably what's going to happen is the extensions are going to be the appeal, right? Somebody has come up with an extension that makes my normal workflow really fast, or I don't know, makes it rainbow colored, and that's the way I have to see everything, or something is going to be where then I go to SSMS and I'm like, I'm only there when I need to. Well, like you said, create an alert or some sort of agent or something like that I need to interact with. And every other time I'm over here because I like the experience a little bit better. What's nice is that's not wrong. That's totally cool. Yeah, use the tooling that you love.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
The other key thing there as well is, you can build your own extension, and it's a lot simpler to build an extension for Visual Studio Code than it is for SSMS.
Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah, you could probably – that is a show we need to have next. How to build an extension.
There you go.
For Data Studio.
Well, I can actually tell you we did a session on that at Build. So we do have a video available on how to get started making extensions for Azure Data Studio. So
sounds like a link for resources.
Very similar to VS Code, but there's a couple additional surface areas that you can work with. So there's a model view controller because in Azure Data Studio, you can do wizards and things. So you can choose to make views using a model view. And then there's something called the DMP, which is the data management protocol, whereby you can add support for additional data services. So basically, once the product is able to understand your database's protocol, you can connect a query window to it and start executing queries.
And it's kind of cool if you create an extension for Data Studio and you use SQL Server over in this project, but you use some other database in this project, you can use that extension to give you same sort of productivity. Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's pretty neat. I mean, it's all pretty neat, Vicki. I mean, when you think about what people don't know is how awesome it is. Give me a way to tell developers how awesome SQL is. What is the gap? What's happening?
I do think that some of it really comes to the fact that people are not thinking about data. They're only thinking of how can I get it faster and why is it not going faster. And so I do try to kind of seed to people the idea that learning a little bit, a little bit about the structures that underlie your data, NoSQL, anything, will go a long way toward you being a well-rounded professional. It's have some joy in your art, and it's not necessarily the right moment whenever you're experiencing an outage or something to go in and I'm going to go learn all this. But whenever you're looking at the next thing you want to learn, spending one Pluralsight course or one book reading time or ebook or something on learning some of those underlying structures, I think it just kind of opens your worldview and makes you a more well-rounded developer. Myself, I was a developer for 12 years before I got into program management, and I worked very intensely with SQL Server. And yeah, I remember the times whenever it was just strange. I'd look at a query plan and I was like, I don't know what this is. This is just a complicated something. And then I'd go in there and I'd see, hash join. Why is it hash join? Well, there's a ton of resources out there that help you learn those things, and you feel more confident and capable as a developer doing that. And so I would say to seed that, but people don't always love to be told that. And so then I just get into the kind of the whiz-bangery of telling people, look how fast this is, and really think about what it would take for you to write the data access, right down to the IO level if you were doing it yourself, and optimizing for this data structure on this processor architecture with this amount of memory, and how much time it's saving you. And if you can't get into loving it for what it is, love it for what it's keeping you from having to do, right?
Well, that's right. And if you don't know that you love T-SQL, just look at PL SQL and you'll realize why it's so great.
That's where I started, PL SQL.
Was it?
Oh yeah.
Well, a lot of people. I think that's the problem. PL SQL made everybody think that databases were crazy.
Yeah.
But that's not our fault. That's the other people.
Yeah.
The other people.
Other people.
Vicki, great job on all this tooling. I mean, in all reality, it's so cool to see everything modernized and everything kind of going and catering to these developers' new workflows. Even the ones that don't understand the power of all the things that they're doing, they at least have all this like tooling that really helps them and is on their side and isn't set up to kind of trap them and make them, look stupid. No, it's make their applications fast and awesome instead. And it's really terrific. And how broad the tooling is, from CLI to all the different desktop applications that we have as well.
And of course, your enthusiasm's so infectious as well.
Yeah, that's right. And Visual Studio. Man, those SQL projects, developers don't know what they're missing when they don't use that. That doesn't work in VS Code, though, does it?
No, so with VS Code, there's an MS SQL extension, but it doesn't have the same service area as the SQL projects.
That's all right. I use Visual Studio, so that's okay. That's been awesome.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.